Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer Sonia Sodha and the Spectator's deputy political editor Katy Balls. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages. The Metro describes as true courage the actions of Afghan women protesting in the streets against the reimposed rule of the Taliban. The Financial Times leads with the Taliban's assertion that they will respect women's rights, as they put it, within Islam's framework. The Express reports that the Home Office intends to allow 20,000 Afghan refugees to settle in Britain. That's also the top story for The Guardian. Picturing two Afghan children, the Mirror urges the UK government to save them. Well, the Telegraph carries an article by the Home Secretary Priti Patel in which she urges the UK's European neighbours to take in refugees as well. And the Daily Star reports on the closure of some Nando's restaurants due to staff shortages and trouble with their supply chain. And tonight we're joined by Sonia Sodha and Katy Balls. Good evening to you both. We're going to kick off with the Financial Times, and it is looking at one of the central themes of that extraordinary news conference, Sonia, that we had from the Taliban in the presidential palace today. What will happen to the rights of women and girls within Afghanistan now?
Yes, that's right. And in the press conference today, we saw the Taliban saying that it would be different this time, that they will respect women's rights within the framework of Islam. But I think those guarantees mean very little to women and girls in Afghanistan. First of all, there's the Taliban's track record, absolutely abhorrent human rights abuses against women in Afghanistan when they ruled Afghanistan in the past, when it comes to things like stoning for committing adultery, amputation of limbs of women who they say are guilty of stealing, for example. And, there was a very important qualifier around what they were saying today, which, they were saying that they would respect women's rights within the framework of Sharia law. And we know what the Taliban's interpretation of Sharia law is, because we've seen it in the past. And we've also seen in recent weeks and months, when they've taken over provincial capitals in Afghanistan, what that has meant for women who live in those areas. And we've had reports of women being targeted in the most awful of ways, underage girls being forced to marry fighters and being raped by them. So I think these promises and pledges, they were probably an attempt by the Taliban to sort of sound moderate, but I don't think they will be very reassuring to people in Afghanistan.
And Katy, the photograph that the FT have chosen on their front page, and I think we've got some moving footage of it, are Afghan women in Kabul demanding the protection of their rights. An extraordinary act of bravery in the face of members of the Taliban right in front of them.
Yes, completely. And it's one of these things where you're seeing women going out and trying to say, well, this is my right to protest. But as you say, it's a very brave act because we are in territory. No one is quite sure what's going to happen. And I think that you can see that in the sense that although the Taliban are talking as though they have found a new respect for women's rights, few believe it. And particularly when these cameras go away, what's going to happen there and what's going to happen to these women? So it's a very brave thing to do. And I think lots of people are actually quite worried for these people in a way for doing it because of the situation they're now in.
Katy, let's have a look at the front page of The Guardian, and that is the news that's broken in the last few minutes, that the UK is to take 20,000 refugees fleeing the Taliban. 20,000 in total, 5,000 in the first year.
Yes, and this is on top of a prior scheme for 5,000. And this comes after Boris Johnson has been under a lot of pressure, I think, from both sides of the House, many MPs within his own party, some of his ministers, to really set out what the UK plans to do. There've been devastating scenes from Afghanistan if you think about the past few days. And I think that everyone agrees that the UK has a moral duty to these people. I think in terms of the scheme, it's based similarly on the Syrian refugee scheme, which is also around 20,000. And it's meant to focus on women and girls and those who are most at need. I think there are still some questions on this. So number one, the speed, the fact that it's 5,000 initially. And two, I think the passage, the journey and how you get there, because we've seen these horrifying pictures of people clinging to planes. And we know that part of the problem right now is actually getting out in the first place. And again, while the Taliban are talking rather, nicely, no one is quite sure what happens once you have a situation where, the US no longer in charge of the airport. So I think there are lots of things to press the detail on when MPs meet tomorrow for the recall of Parliament to debate these measures.
Yeah, and Sonia, the UK commander in charge of the evacuations from the UK side there in Kabul, admitting today that they don't know how long they'll be allowed to operate there for. I mean, it is a race against time to get people back. We are waiting for the next flight to come in to Brize Norton tonight. But what do you make on the announcement of this resettlement scheme for 20,000?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that any resettlement scheme is obviously better than no resettlement scheme. So that in and of itself is good news. But I agree with Katy that there are serious questions to be asked. First of all, looking back at the government's record, we've had people urging for months and weeks that the government was not doing enough to bring over people at risk who've worked with the British government, who were really seriously at risk from the Taliban advance in Afghanistan. And even, 3-4 weeks ago, we had ex-military chiefs writing to the government saying they urgently needed to reconsider this because there are people who have worked with the British government, perhaps not directly employed, but who've been having asylum applications under this scheme being turned down. And the government just didn't do enough on that. It didn't act urgently enough. Then there are these questions about, fine, it's good to have these routes, but it's coming so late that actually how are people going to get out? And then I think there's a question to be asked about the scale of the scheme as well. And Alf Dobbs raises these questions in that Guardian article. 5,000 in 1 year doesn't feel like many when you consider Britain's involvement in Afghanistan over the years, and the fact that actually we take far fewer asylum seekers and refugees than many other European countries. We're 17th down the list in Europe when you look at the number of refugees we take per population head. So is this really Britain doing its bit? It's a start, but I think that we should have been doing more in the run-up to this, which everyone was predicting, perhaps not so fast. And I think 5,000 in 1 year will leave people asking a lot of questions about whether it's enough in the here and now.
We've got two very different takes on this in the Express and the Mirror. If we have a look at the Express first, big-hearted Britain to take 20,000 refugees, the headline there, women and girls being given priority, being modelled on the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, widely viewed as a success, Katy. And the Mirror then has a photograph of two siblings seeking refuge in Kabul, saying, save them. The Mirror's approach to this is 5,000 this year. It just isn't enough.
Yes, and ultimately suggesting the government needs to go further. And I think that would be a fairly popular view when MPs meet in the House of Commons tomorrow. Speaking to Tory MPs today, lots were saying, well, at minimum we should have 30,000. Some were saying figures much higher. So I do think there'll be pressure on that. But there's obviously questions about how realistic it is, how practical it is to get schemes like this going. But I do think you've got that headline figure. But the fact it's only 5,000 in the first year, I think is going to get a lot of attention. I think, as Sonia touched on, the thing we really can't escape here is ultimately the government has been caught on the hop. It's been caught by surprise at how fast things moved in Afghanistan, and that means that the preparations have not been in place. And I think there are serious questions to answer on that, particularly when you think about the various, there's lots of stories today, interpreters who had their applications paused or slowed down by the Home Office, now in really very vulnerable and dangerous situations, hiding out. And I think it's a question as to really how fast this can move. And I think, as the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace ultimately said in an interview this week, not everyone is going to be able to get here. And I think that is what can't really be escaped, despite obviously progress with the scheme.
Yeah, certainly plenty of questions for the Prime Minister when Parliament's recalled tomorrow, Sonia. He's been speaking to President Biden this evening, and a G7 meeting to be convened.
Yeah, that's right. And President Biden has come in for a huge amount of criticism over the last kind of 48 hours, both domestically in the US, but also internationally, I think. And I think, obviously Boris Johnson's words to President Joe Biden that have been released, they're very diplomatic, they're very polite, as you would expect. But I think behind the scenes, there's a lot of anger amongst, British diplomats at not just the direction that US policy was heading in, because I think, even when Biden was Obama's vice president, it was quite clear what he thought about the US presence in Afghanistan. But I think what's just really shocked international observers actually is that the reckless way in which the US has just drawn out in order to meet some arbitrary deadline, in a way that actually some experts were warning that this would lead to a collapse of the Afghan army because of the complete loss of morale that would generate amongst Afghan troops, the reliance on a small number of American troops for their expertise on aircraft power, for example. So I think this is going to really hurt Joe Biden in the medium term. And I think we might end up looking on this as something that harms the US and indeed the West's strategic interests, not just the people of Afghanistan. And actually, it's being reported tonight that Biden's ratings are the lowest that they've ever been. They've fallen 7 points. And I think that that's probably not something that his officials and his advisors would have been expecting.
Yeah, Joe Biden, of course, defiant in that news conference last night that this was a binary choice between a forever war or getting out. Let's take a short break. Katy and Sonia back with us in just a couple of minutes. And we will be discussing the COVID jab, which has been approved for use on children as young as 12. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me, Sonia Sodha and Katy Balls. We're going to turn to the front of the Telegraph now, and it has a story about the SNP and concerns being expressed about plans to retain pandemic powers. Sonia, what powers are we talking about?
So these are some of the extraordinary powers that Westminster sort of took, and the Scottish were given to the Scottish government in the case of a pandemic. So the powers, for example, to impose lockdown, to close schools, to require people to wear face coverings in public. So really, this is a political row that's brewing because the Scottish government feels that these are powers that should reside with the Scottish government in case of future pandemics, whereas the Westminster government is saying these were extraordinary powers. We're going to take them back, and it was just for this pandemic. And so I think this is essentially a political row about devolution and where these powers should sit in the long term. Because I think there's no question that if there's a pandemic again, we will need to see these sort of measures. If it's a similar sort of pandemic, it's just about who's got the power to enforce them.
Katy.
I think it's interesting because it hints at, I think, what some governments are now grappling with, which is, are we changing how we govern after a health crisis in anticipation of future ones, or is this a power grab? And I do think here you can see how it'd be useful to a government, particularly things so uncertain. If you look at the Israeli government at the moment, thinking about this fourth wave of COVID, to move quickly and move fast. But then I also think that if these measures are really as popular as the SNP are claiming, it should be a problem getting support to bring them back in, remove them as and when anyway. And we do have to be a bit wary, I think, of giving the state powers that then are almost without scrutiny to a degree.
Sonia, let's have a look at the Metro, staying with COVID, and the Moderna jab, which has been authorised for 12 to 17-year-olds today.
Yes, that's right. So the health regulator has authorised a second vaccine as safe for 12 to 17-year-olds. That's a Moderna vaccine alongside the Pfizer vaccine. Now, this is significant because it means 16 and 17-year-olds will be able to get the Moderna vaccine as well as Pfizer. But like with Pfizer, we've got a regulator saying it's safe for 12 to 17-year-olds, but the decision about whether to actually roll it out to them, that is based on a recommendation made by a committee called the JCVI, who weighs up not just safety in the abstract, but other ethical sort of concerns around giving vaccines to children. So, for example, how much direct benefit do children get from the vaccines? How much is a benefit to society? So there's no signs yet that this is going to be extended downwards towards 12-year-olds, and I think it will continue to be a very live debate.
OK, and let's look at one other story then, Katy, with you, and this is in the Star. Nando's clucked by the pingdemic. Now, my kids wanted to go to Nando's today and the doors were closed to sign up. We are temporarily closed because of supply issues.
Yes, so that would be one of, I think, 50 stores affected by this, or 50 restaurants in the Nando's chain. And they're saying this is a pandemic chaos. And I think it goes not so much of it, understand it's waiting staff, so much as deliveries, and how that's also affecting some pubs, but it ultimately means no peri chicken. So the paper points out this is good news if you're a vegetarian or a chicken. Probably worth pointing out Nando's do have vegetarian options. But I think probably the good news here is the pandemic should, in theory, be easing quite soon, because as of Monday, the rules change for the double vaccine.